Okay, so if you've been watching the news, you know that there's been a lot of stuff happening in Los Angeles, California, in particular with the Trump administration sending the National Guard and the Marines and other things like that. If you go on the internet, there's a lot of like really dumb information from all sides about how we should think about this. So what I'm going to try to do today is maybe just offer some thoughts and put it in some kind of context. You can kind of think through this maybe a little better. I think the first thing we need to point out, and I think this is just a fact, I'm not trying to be inflammatory, what Donald Trump is doing is breaking the law. And let me explain why. It really all centers on the National Guard, who are the National Guard and how they operate. To give you a little bit of history lessons, kind of goes back to the Second Amendment. So if you've read the Second Amendment recently, basically you probably don't know what it means. Each state has something called a militia. Militia was basically everyday citizens who were expected to come together and defend their state if something jumped off. What the Second Amendment was about was basically saying that the states have a right to have a militia and the federal government cannot meddle with the militia. Now, we don't have militias anymore. At some point, every single state transitioned from a militia model to a National Guard model. Back in the day, if you were just an able-bodied man, you were automatically enrolled in the militia. That eventually changes, so that the only people in the National Guard are people who signed up and wanted to be. Now, the National Guard is a weird entity because it's kind of a federal state-level partnership. So there's 54 National Guards in the country, 50 states, and then 4 territories, including Guam and Puerto Rico. Each of them have their own National Guard. The governor of each state is primarily in charge of the National Guard, and each governor gets to decide if and when the National Guard is deployed within their state. If the president wants to deploy the National Guard, according to the law, they have to do so in coordination and with the express permission of the governor. In most cases, and I'll come back to that point, but in the vast majority of cases, that's what the president has to do. So just on that alone, the president of the United States is objectively breaking the law. Only one time in U.S. history has the president ever used the National Guard without a governor's permission, and that was in 1965, when the governor of Alabama was essentially breaking federal law and keeping the desegregation efforts from happening, and President Lyndon Johnson overruled the governor and used the National Guard to make sure that the law was applied and followed. The only time that's happened. So the second time that's happened is now. And I think the circumstances are very different, as I think we're going to find as I talk a little more. This whole thing is complicated because in addition to the National Guard, the president has brought in Marines, which, to be frank, is disturbing. Let me explain why. In 1878, the U.S. Congress passed a law called the Posse Comitatus Act. It basically said the president cannot use the U.S. military against private citizens. The year before, the president at the time, who was Rutherford B. Hayes, had used the U.S. military to stop a really violent railroad strike. About 100 people were killed. It was really unpopular, and this is part of the reason why this act was passed the next year. Not the only reason, but one of the main reasons. However, there is a carve-out. The president can overrule governors and can deploy troops on U.S. soil against U.S. citizens in very, very, very limited circumstances. Let me explain what those are. The only time a president can do that is when they are invoking what's called the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is actually not one act, it's actually a series of acts that kind of got smushed together and built on, that Congress passed between 1792 and 1871. The Insurrection Act essentially authorizes the president to use the military against private citizens in very, very, very narrow circumstances. And that is, as the name implies, a situation in which law and order has completely broken down and local authorities have no power to control it. Just objectively speaking, that is not what's happening in Los Angeles. Most of the protests are peaceful, and the instances of violence absolutely do not constitute an insurrection. Here's the thing, though. The president has not invoked the Insurrection Act. Why is President Trump doing this? Now, of course, I don't know. I can't read his mind. But if history is any guide, and if some of his past statements are any guide, I have a few theories that I think are good ones. And again, when I say theory, these are based on the analysis of facts, not theories based on like conspiracies. Number one, I think he's doing this because he's a wannabe dictator. If you look at any dictator throughout history, regardless of what country we're in, what time period we're in, dictators have kind of like a playbook. But there are certain things all dictators do. And one of them is that they treat their nation's military as if it was kind of like their private security force that they can deploy to kind of do whatever they want. Donald Trump obviously wants to do that. He promised on the campaign trail that if protests broke out, he was going to deploy the U.S. military against them, right? So we know just based on his public statements, based on his temperament, based on basically everything he's ever said, his constant love of violence, that he's kind of been frothing at the mouth to really do this, and he sees an opportunity to. I think the second reason why he's doing it is because he knows that fear works. Donald Trump does not want people to protest him. And he knows that the only thing that will stop him is large-scale unrest and protests. So he is trying to nip this in the bud. He doesn't care that he's breaking the law. He's trying to use all of the power and force of the U.S. military to intimidate these protesters into submission. Number three is, I think, maybe kind of obvious by now, and I kind of already alluded to it, but I think he really wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. There are headlines where he's saying he's not going to invoke it yet, but we'll see, right? Like, come on. This is not an insurrection. And here's the thing. He's already demonstrated a pattern of like objectively breaking the law, objectively violating constitutional norms. He doesn't care about that stuff. What his administration has been doing since day one is doing things that are illegal, trying to do as much as they can before the courts stop them, and then freaking out and attacking the courts when the courts do their job and stopping him from doing unlawful things. Something's going to happen. He's going to say, okay, this is an insurrection. He's going to send in the troops. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I guess we'll see. Number 4, this is totally speculative, and I don't know if this is actually true, but I think it's interesting. Maybe he's kind of like practicing or preparing us for his military parade. So on June 14th in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump is doing something that only dictators do, which is have a parade celebrating the strength of our military. Now, the U.S. has had military parades in the past. However, every single time we've had them, it has been because we won some kind of military conflict. Never before in U.S. history has a president said, let's just have a parade because the military is awesome and we want to show people how big and strong we are. This is textbook authoritarianism. This is what dictators do, right? And maybe Trump is kind of like testing the waters to see what he can really get away with. One of the things he said is anyone who protests his military parade will be met with force. So maybe he's kind of like practicing and doing a little dry run of what we might be seeing, unfortunately, this Saturday. And I think the 5th reason, and I feel like this reason has undergirded all my other reasons, is power. He loves power. That's it. He loves power. He wants it. He will try to get as much as he can, which again is what dictators do. I should add too that he cares more about power than about fiscal responsibility. The Pentagon has estimated that this little military operation he's trying to do in Los Angeles is going to cost, by the time it's done, about $134 million. So, we can't find money for like poor people to have health care, but we can obviously find money to send a bunch of troops to a protest that is not an insurrection.